The air at Camp Blackwood didn't just shimmer. It vibrated. At 4,000 feet above sea level, the high desert sun turned the long-range ballistic course into a furnace of distorted light and biting dust. Silas Vance sat 20 feet behind the firing line, his back against the rough grain of a wooden observation post. He was a man made of scars and silence, a rhetorite. Tier 1 operator whose name was still whispered in the halls of Fort Bragg. He didn't come to these trials to be impressed. He came because he was looking for a lie. On the line stood Reagan Thorne. She didn't look like a reaper. She was lean, her movements economical, her skin tanned to the color of cured leather. She chambered around into the custom-built 408 Chatak M200 intervention with a sound like a bank vault. Closing. Target, 800 meters. A steel torso plate. The wind was a jagged, gusting beast, switching from 9 to 3 o'clock without warning. Crack. The recoil didn't seem to move her. She cycled the bolt. Crack. A second later, the bolt moved again. Crack. The spotting scope caught the result before the sound of the steel impact even traveled back to the line. Silas leaned in, his breath catching. One hole, not a group, a single, ragged puncture in the exact center of the X-ring. 3 bullets had occupied the exact same coordinate in spacetime. The range, usually a cacophony of ego and gear tuck, fell into a suffocating silence. The veteran instructors, men who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of the cold bore shot, looked at their data pads and then at each other. This wasn't a tight group. This was a defiance of physics. Silas felt a cold, familiar ache in his shoulder, the spot where a piece of shrapnel lived. A souvenir from a mission in Tora Bora, where a single missed shot had cascaded into a massacre. He knew what perfect looked like. He had chased it his whole life. But what Reagan Thorne just did wasn't perfection. It was something clinical. It was mastery that felt hollow, as if the human element to doubt, the heartbeat, the flicker of the eye had been surgically removed. The silence was broken by Captain Miller Reed. Reed was the kind of man who carried his medals in his posture. As a decorated SEAL commander, his authority was absolute, his legacy built on the sweat and blood of the men he led. To him, Thorne's performance wasn't a feat to be celebrated. It was a personal insult. "Check the bore," Red barked, stepping onto the firing point. "Check the optics. I want a full diagnostic on that rifle." No one shoots a subquarter MOA group in a crosswind like that. Not without a computer doing the heavy lifting. He paced around Thorne like a predator, circling a strange new species. He looked for a wire, a heads-up display, a motorized stabilizer. He found nothing but a standard, albeit high-end, long-range platform. Reagan Thorne didn't flinch. She stood up, her expression as flat as the horizon. With a series of practiced, ceremonial movements, she began to strip the rifle. She laid the bolt, the firing pin, and the glass on a canvas mat with the reverence of a monk. "It's the equipment, Commander," Reed sneered, his voice tight with an insecurity he couldn't hide. "Or it's a fluke. You want to prove you belong in this tier? Do it again with a standard issue rack. Grade." Thorne looked at him then. Her eyes weren't angry. They were distant. "It isn't the rifle, Captain," she said, her voice a low hum. "And it isn't the wind. It's just steel and breath." The words hit the gathered operators like a physical blow. In their world, rank was everything. Gender was a hurdle. Legacy was a shield. But Thorne's steel and breath suggested that none of those things mattered. It suggested that the old guard, the men who built their identities on being the best, were simply obsolete. Silas Vance, watching from the shadows, realized the truth. The men weren't afraid she was cheating. They were afraid she was better. 48 hours later, Silas Vance found himself in the last place a man like him ever wanted to be. Arlington, Virginia. He stood before a building that didn't exist on any city map. No flag flew from the roof. There were no brass plaques, just a reinforced steel door and a biometric scanner that recognized his retinas before he even reached the threshold. Inside, the atmosphere changed from the humid Virginia heat to the sterile, pressurized chill of a laboratory. "She's a marvel, isn't she?" Silas turned to see Dr. Julian Vane. Vane was a man of high foreheads and thin smiles. The kind of intellectual who viewed the world as a series of equations to be solved. She's a ghost, Silas grunted. I've seen the best. I've trained the best. Thorne isn't the best. She's something else. Vane led him into a darkened observation room. On the other side of the glass, Thorne sat in a chair, her head covered in a lattice of electrodes. Project Aphelion, Vane whispered. We don't recruit excellence, Silas. We engineer it. We've mapped the neural pathways of the greatest marksmen in history, including yours. We've found the noise, the fear, the hesitation, the biological impulse to blink, and we've learned how to turn it off. Silas felt a surge of revulsion. You're building robots. No, Vane countered. We are perfecting the human weapon. Thorne is the first successful integration. She doesn't have to try to hit a target. To her, the bullet hitting the mark is as inevitable as the sun rising. We aren't asking if the limits of human performance can be broken anymore. We've already shattered them. The briefing room was underground, cooled to a crisp 60 degrees. General Marcus Sterling, a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of a mountainside, stood before a satellite feed of the Hindu Kush. This is Ashak al-Zarani, Sterling said, pointing to a grainy image of a man surrounded by stone walls and heavy weaponry. He is the architect of the next decade of insurgency. He is currently located in the searing region, tucked into a notch in the mountains that is unreachable by drone. The electronic warfare environment there is too dense for remote assets. A ground raid would be a suicide mission, a 3-day climb into a meat grinder. He paused, letting the weight of the problem sink in. The solution is a single kinetic strike, Sterling continued. But the distance is 3,400 meters. The room went cold. 3.4 meters over 2 miles. At that distance, the bullet would be in the air for nearly 10 seconds. The shooter would have to account for the curvature of the Earth, the rotation of the planet, the varying air densities of 3 different mountain paths, and a vertical drop that would require aiming hundreds of feet above the target. Physics is the enemy here. Sterling sighed. If we miss, al-Zarani vanishes into the caves, and the window closes forever. If we fail, the diplomatic fallout of a dead American team on that soil starts a war we are UN ready for. He looked at Silas. You're the observer, Vance. You're there to verify the kill and ensure the morality is secondary. The outcome is the only metric that matters. The insertion was a nightmare of low oxygen and jagged rock. Project Aphelion's team, consisting of Silas, Thorne, and a small security detail, were dropped by a stealth-capable MH-47 at the edge of the dead zone. The climb toward Karazhan Pass was a test of raw endurance. The cold was a physical weight, stripping the bravado from the security team. Men who had survived SEAL training found themselves gasping for air, their lungs burning in the thin, frozen atmosphere. But Thorne moved like a mountain cat. She didn't sweat. She didn't pant. She moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic pace that never wavered. As they reached the final observation post, a narrow ledge overlooking the valley where Al's compound sat, Silas watched her prepare. He expected to see nerves. He expected to see the presciat ritual of a sniper, the deep breathing, the calming of the heart. Instead, he saw resignation. Thorne looked at the rifle, not with pride, but as if it were a heavy cross she was forced to carry. You don't want to be here, Silas said, his voice a whisper against the wind. Thorne didn't look up from her ballistic computer. I don't want anything, Silas. That was the first thing they took. I just know that the bullet belongs in that valley. My job is just to let it go. The sun was beginning to crest the eastern peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley floor. Thorne was prone, her body fused with the rock, the long barrel of the Chitak protruding from a camouflage mesh. Target identified, Silas whispered into his cums, his eye glued to the high-powered spotting scope. Al-Zarani is on the balcony. He's moving. We have 90 seconds before he goes back inside. Suddenly, the radio crackled with static and the panicked voice of their rearguard. Contact! We're burned. Enemy QRF quick reaction forces moving up the south slope. They knew we were coming. Muzzle flashes erupted from the ridge behind them. The security team began returning fire, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed carbines echoing through the pass. Command! We are compromised. Silas shouted over the noise. Request immediate extraction. Negative. General Sterling's voice came through, cold and distant. The shot takes priority. Take the shot, Thorne, now or never. The enemy was closing. Bullets began to chip the rocks around them. A fragment of stone sliced Silas's cheek. He looked at Thorne. She hadn't moved. She was a statue in the middle of a hurricane. Reagan, Silas yelled. They're on us. She adjusted the elevation dial by 2 clicks. Her voice was a haunting anchor in the chaos. I won't miss. The world narrowed to a single point. Thorne pulled the trigger. The rifle's report was suppressed, but the shockwave still kicked up a cloud of dust. In the spotting scope, Silas watched the impossible happen. The bullet traveled through the thin mountain air, crossing 3 different thermal layers. It dipped into the valley, fighting the crosswinds of the pass, and began its long, arched descent. For 9.8 seconds, history hung in the air. In the compound 3,400 meters away, Ishak al-Zarani was reaching for a cup of tea. He never felt the impact. The .408 round, still traveling at supersonic speeds, struck him with the force of a sledgehammer. He was gone before the sound of the rifle could even reach the valley. Target down, Silas breathed, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. A 3,400-meter execution, a feat that rewrote every manual on ballistic warfare ever written. But there was no time for celebration. The canyon exploded. The enemy QRF had reached their perimeter, and a rocket-propelled grenade RPG detonated 10 feet above their position, showering them in glass and debris. Move. Move. Silas grabbed Thorne by the tactical vest, hauling her back as their position was overrun. They were pinned down, trapped between a sheer drop and a wall of enemy fire. Silas emptied a magazine into the tree line, knowing they were seconds away from being liquidated. Suddenly, a heavy machine gun opened up from the western flank, shredding the enemy line. A team of operators in specialized mountain gear surged forward, throwing fragmentation grenades with lethal precision. Silas looked up to see a familiar face through the smoke. It was Captain Miller Reed. The man who had tried to disgrace Thorne at the range was now bleeding from a shoulder wound, his face masked in soot, leading his sentinel team into the mouth of hell to save the program he hated. "Get her to the bird," Reed roared, gesturing toward a distant hum in the sky. In the chaos of extraction, the truth became irrelevant. It didn't matter that Reed was jealous, or that the program was an ethical nightmare. In the dirt, there was only the brotherhood of those who survived. Reed, the old order, was laying down his life to protect the replacement. As the helicopter banked away from the ridge, Silas saw Reed collapse into the bay, his eyes meeting Thorne's. There was no apology, no reconciliation, only the grim acknowledgement of 2 ghosts passing in the night. Back at the secure facility, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and expensive coffee. General Sterling and Dr. Vane stood before a wall of monitors, analyzing the data from Thorne's HUD. They talked about metrics, scalability, and lethality doctrine. To them, the mission was a triumphant proof of concept. They were already planning the next Fazan, entire platoon of Thorns. Reagan Thorne stood in the corner of the room. She had been cleaned up, her wounds dressed, but she looked more hollow than ever. She wasn't proud of the record-breaking shot. She wasn't broken by the combat. She was simply aware that she was no longer a person, but a system. Silas Vance stood by the window, watching the sun set over the Virginia hills. He saw the cost clearly now. The line between soldier and machine hadn't just been moved. It had been erased. By perfecting the soldier, they had killed the soul of the warrior. She did what no human could do, Vane said, stepping up beside Silas. "You're right," Silas replied, his voice heavy with grief. "But that's the problem, isn't it? A human would have felt the weight of it. She just felt the recoil." As the weeks passed, Reagan Thorne disappeared into the deep layers of classified obscurity. Legends began to circulate in the special operations community about the ghost of Karazhan, the woman who could bend the wind and see through mountains. But Silas Vance didn't tell those stories. He retired for good this time, moving to a quiet cabin far from the reach of the Aphelion protocol. He often thought about the silence after the shate, 10 seconds when the bullet was in the air. In those 10 seconds, anything was possible. But once the bullet landed, the world changed forever. He realized the truth beneath the myth. Progress in war doesn't erase ghosts. It just creates more efficient ways to make them. The impossible becoming routine didn't make the world safer. It just made it more cold. In our modern world, we are obsessed with optimization. We use apps to track our sleep, AI to write our emails, and data to dictate our lives. We strive for a perfect version of ourselves, where failure is impossible. But the lesson of Reagan Thorne is this: perfection is a sterile room. Our humanity lies in our flaws, our hesitations, and our ability to feel the weight of our choices. When we remove the noise of our emotions to become more efficient, we risk losing the very thing that makes our achievements worth having. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the intersection of technology, humanity, and the warrior spirit. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a mission.